Malcolm Gladwell is a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. His provocative and unique take on the world has even spawned its own term, Gladwellian. He is the author of 5 enormously popular books, among them The Tipping Point, Blink and Outliers, and his newest book is David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. Here this evening, in conversation with Malcolm Gladwell, is Michael Lewis, best-selling author of Boomerang, The Big Short, The Blind Side, and Moneyball. Please give a warm Castro and JCCSF welcome to Malcolm Gladwell and Michael Lewis.
So Malcolm.
Yes.
You've written a book.
I have, yes.
Before we get to the book, I want to start with you. Malcolm and I have known each other for more than 20 years, I think. I met Malcolm when he just started at the Washington Post. And we have lots of mutual friends. And after I met him, after I read your first pieces, I can remember saying to one of our mutual friends, he's going to be very famous someday. He was clearly destined for great things. And early on in our relationship, I made the mistake of getting in an argument with him.
Oh, really? You have a very good memory.
And I was just trounced at my own dinner party and left in tatters. And I remember thinking, never again am I going to get in an argument with you in public. So if we find ourselves in conflict this evening, we will just demur and move on.
Okay.
This book Malcolm's written is an example of his talent. It's enormously persuasive. It's counterintuitive, but it's different in one way, and I think it's more emotional than anything he's written. And it is persuasive. It takes as its thesis that disadvantage is often advantage, and advantage is often disadvantage. And it is inspiring for little guys everywhere who read this. And as you are so persuasive and so well-read, I wonder if you worry that you're going to be responsible for millions of little guys getting the crap beaten out of them. Because you've inspired them to take on the Goliaths in the world.
Yeah.
So let's start. As I said, I'd like to start with you. And some of the things I've heard recently about you. For example, I've heard that you've returned to running.
I have.
Can you tell us a little bit about your running career?
Well, I was briefly in high school. I peaked at the age of 14. And when I was 14, I was a very, very good middle distance runner for my age class. But I sensed correctly that it was all going to go downhill. Because there's two things. One is that when you're an age class athlete, it's true of all athletes, but when you're immersed in a sport, you understand that there's a distinction between the day-to-day performance of you and your peers and how good people actually are. So you know, just because you beat someone doesn't mean you're better than them. So I was beating particularly this one runner named Dave Reed.
Tell us who Dave Reed is.
He ended up being the great Canadian distance runner of his generation. And when I was 13, I beat him by about 10 yards. And then when I was 14, I beat him by about 3 yards. And I did the math. I understood that this was not sustainable. And I looked at him, and I understood that he is actually a much better runner than I am. And I also understood in the crude way that one does at that age, that I had hair on my legs and he did not, which suggested that puberty had happened to me and perhaps it hadn't happened to him, which meant that the minute he got hair in his legs, I was toast. So I quit. I quit at 15. I was gone because I knew I beat him one last time by like a hair's breadth. And I was like, all right, that's it. And then
You quit running.
Well, I quit racing, and I ran casually on and off for the next many, many decades. And then very recently, I just got hooked again, and I've been enjoying myself. And now I'm filled with regret, actually, about having quit so long ago.
You think you missed years of mediocrity?
I think but the problem is, as a kid, I was an absolutist, and I thought that unless you were going to win, there was no point.
Did you really think that?
I did. I had all kinds of very, very curious ideas when I was a kid. And then now I understand that who cares, right? But then I really thought the notion that Dave Reed would beat me was so kind of catastrophic that the only way I could deal with it was just by leaving the sport entirely. And I also didn't understand that you could be a runner and something else. To my mind, it was a category that would absorb your entire life. So I thought that, I could be a runner or I could read books, but I couldn't actually juggle both.
Is there a place where all the energy that went into the running went when you stopped running?
Well, it's sort of, if you talk to people who knew me when I was 13, they would have said that I was a jock. And so I kind of got to reinvent my image. I mean, we're talking about small town Ontario, but I don't think anyone I don't even knew what an image was. The notion that someone would have an image was like so bizarre. That's something that would happen in Toronto maybe, but not in, but I got to sort of reinvent myself as someone who was kind of bookish and, was on the debate team as opposed to the guy who was the runner.
Do you get mistaken for being American often?
Well, I go so far out of my way to make it absolutely clear that I'm not an American.
No, because there's this tendency for every Canadian who becomes successful to become an honorary American. When Canadians become famous in America, everybody just assumes they must be American.
No, but privately we keep track of who's Canadian, and I could give you a list this long of all of us can. I mean, we're very good at this game. And
you're insistent on your Canadianness.
Well, this is one of the great, one of the many. I'm sort of recently gotten very interested in contradiction, and on the idea that as human beings, it used to be this notion that what we do, the project of human personality, is to explain away all the contradictions in your life. I now think this is nonsense. In fact, the opposite is true. What we do as human beings is exploit our contradictions. We willingly enter into contradiction because contradictions give you all kinds of freedom to do things that you couldn't otherwise do. So we're drawn to them. Anyway, my point is, I am this massive contradiction. The longer I live in the United States and don't live in Canada, the more kind of vociferously I proclaim Canada's virtues. So when I left Canada years ago, I was like, Now I'm like, it's like the greatest place in the world. You guys have so much to learn from my country. That's my whole MO now.
What are Canadian virtues?
Oh, do we have to ask?
We don't have to ask.
They're so numerous. Canadians are, and I don't need to tell you that I'm not going to in any way blow your cover, but you are writing a book right now about a Canadian, so you know all about this. Canadians we're modest, we're self-effacing. we would never talk about how great we are. The great things about Canada, I really like the idea that the modesty thing is actually really, really important because it's institutionalized, the modesty is. So it really, you find yourself when you're in Canada, one talks differently. You can't express
When
yourself
when
in the
you
same
say
way.
it's institutionalized, what do you mean by that?
I mean, it's so deeply embedded in the culture. Like, this is actually a very serious and beautiful thing about Canada, but I remember my parents switched churches, and they started going to the Mennonite church in my area, where I grew up was very Mennonite. And the Mennonites I think of their value system as being at the absolute heart of Canadianness. And my father was describing coming home from a congregational meeting where they were choosing a new assistant pastor. And I said to him, so the pastor ran the meeting. Like, how did that work? He's like, the pastor didn't run the meeting. The pastor was in the audience with everyone else. The meeting was run by someone in the church, but the pastor participated in the process of choosing his deputy on the same level as everyone in the congregation. Now, that is both beautifully Mennonite, but also that's beautifully Canadian. That the leader sits in the congregation, right? Not at the front. In fact, the leader goes out of their way to act in the least leader-like fashion. And that, that, not to get overly sentimental, but that sort of thing about Canada that moves me, right? It's like, that's fantastic. To live in a culture where it's not exceptional for the leader to want to do that, lead from behind.
Why did you leave?
Well, I didn't mean to leave. I tried to get a job in Canada, but it was the middle of the recession. And then I applied for a job at this sort of disreputable right-wing magazine. And I didn't know anything about the magazine. Some friend showed me they had a job.
Did you think of yourself as a disreputable right-winger?
Well, I was briefly, at that point in my life, a right-winger. Because every other opportunity for rebellion had been cut off. I had no options. I couldn't do drugs because there literally were no drugs in my high school. The rebels in my high school smoked cigarettes, and I was a runner. I couldn't smoke cigarettes. My mother, bless her heart, there were no rules for me. I announced to my mother in a failed attempt at rebellion. I said to her when I was in high school that my friend Terry and I had devised this way of, we decided that we were unhappy with the traditional metrics of success in high school grades. And we wanted to do a system where you would multiply your grade by the number of days that you were absent from school. And so there was a degree of difficulty. If you could get a really high average while also having a high number of absences, that was like amazing. So we embarked on this process of trying to get really great grades while never going to college. So I thought this is like a very clever way of rebellion, right? So I thought I put my mother in a box. What was she going to do to this? So what did she do? She said, that's a great idea. And the next time she ran into the principal at some town thing, she said, I should tell you, my mother's very polite, I should tell you that Malcolm and his friend Terry probably won't be attending school as diligently this. And then she wrote these notes that had, Malcolm is, to be excused from school today. And she left the date blank. And she would just give me, like, bunches of these. And so I was like, I can't win. So what was left? Well, Canada was pretty far to the left in those years. This is the late 70s. So I was like, all right, I'm going to become a right-winger. Like, I'll show her. So I was a dutiful, I read William F. Buckley books, and I subscribed to National Review, and I rode away to the RNC and got a big poster of Ronald Reagan, put on my wall, next to the Cheryl Teague's poster. And that was my way of thumbing my nose and sort of, but then I got to college and realized that I would never get a girl if there was a Ronald. You can't. It is a Ronald Reagan poster in a Canadian college on your dorm room is a prophylactic. It is. It is you are guaranteeing that you will never have any kind of relations with a woman. So that I very hastily abandoned my politics and sought more mainstream avenues of rebellion.
But you found your way to the American Spectator.
So I did. So then I had never heard of it, but then this friend of mine brought me the American Spectator. It had an ad in the back. It's one of my favorite stories, for an assistant managing editor. And I had failed to get a job, and I was approaching the end of my senior year in college, and I was jobless. So I was like kind of panicked. So I wrote away. It's like literally, it's like thing. You write away for the ad in the back of the magazine. I wrote away to the ad, and they sent back a form that I had to fill out, an application, 5 pages. The last question of which was, why do you want to work for the American Spectator? Now, and they gave you this much space, right, to fill in. Now, I had no idea. I never read the magazine. So I just wrote one sentence, doesn't everyone want to work for the American Spectator? And I got the job. So to my utter astonishment. So I moved to Bloomington, Indiana, where it was, and discovered to my horror that what Bloomington, Indiana was, which is culturally about as far from Canada as you can get. I remember turning on the local, I'll never forget this, television, and there was an ad, there would be ads on late night TV for this local gun shop, and there was this guy named Bud something, and he would do the ads himself, and the ad consisted of him shooting various weapons at a target just over and over again. So that's, the ad's like 30 seconds. So the first 25 seconds is just him taking one form of weapon after another. And then he just turns to the camera at the end and he says, I don't want to make money. I just love to sell guns. And here I was, this sort of, sheltered Canadian boy from the hinterlands of the Bible Belt in southern Ontario. And I was in Indiana, looking at this. I mean, it was quite
I had a friend in Alabama who came back from a trip to Canada and said how horrible Canadians were. And he said because when he got to the border, they harassed him. They went through his car and tried to take away all his guns. And I said, well, did they get your gun? He goes, oh, no, I keep it in the Kleenex box. But you're filling in a mental map of you for me. How did you get to the idea in your head that you wanted to be a writer in the first place? I mean, why are you even applying for a job in a magazine?
Well, I had a zine in college remember zines, with my 2 best friends. And the zine was called Ad Hominem, a journal of slander and critical opinion. And it was a series of, the rule was you had to attack someone in every article. And so we just wrote these kind of screeds, and we would run it off on the photocopier and distribute, sort of. And then our big thing was, we'd put out issues, and then we would constantly put out best of issues, which we would call the essential ad hominem, which we thought was hilarious. And so I kind of got it in my head, because I was reading all this William F. Buckley, and he was inspiring me, I got it in my head that but I never thought of it it didn't occur to me you could do that as a job. So I tried to get a job in advertising, and I couldn't. And so then it was just by accident that I got this. It really was. I had never conceived of myself going into journalism. It seemed ridiculous. I was going to go to law school or business school or something.
So then what happens?
I got fired, and I was illegal. I'm sure I've told this story so many times, but I was illegal for a while, and then I was caught because I didn't really want to lie. And so I was you'd always try to sneak through. I'd have my parents drive me across the border. But one time I got caught.
To get to the American Spectator?
No, I was now living in Washington, but I was illegal. And I got caught. They were going to deport me. And this is pre-9/11. And I said to the guy at the border, look, I have a doctor's appointment. It's very important. Can we just delay this for a couple days? He said, sure. So I go home, and I quit my job, and I sublet my apartment and I give away all my belongings. And I go to the INS and I go to the office to get deported. And they make you wait. And I go in, and this guy 2 hours later comes in and looks at me, rifles through all these files, leaves, come back, rifles through more files, leaves, comes back. And finally, he looks at me and he goes, I don't know who you are, what your name is, but why you're here. I've lost your file. And I just went back and got my apartment back and my job. And whenever people denounce the American bureaucracy for its inefficiency, I always go, there are times when the inefficiency can serve you very well. So I've had a soft spot in my heart ever since then for big government. But that's literally why I'm here. I mean, I'd be in Canada as a lawyer if my file had not been.
But you didn't feel any particular calling to be a journalist or a writer or anything like that. You just kind of stumbled into it?
Yeah, I used to write in college. The only the writing I did was sports writing. And because we had no sports in our college, we had this one sort of vaguely intramural football team. So what my friend Bruce and I did is we invented, because no one went to the games. So the whole thing was, we decided we would write about the football team for the school newspaper. And because literally no one went to the games, when I say no one went to the games. So we just made everything up because no one would know. So we invented this coach named Wexford Harding because we thought that sounded really Southern. And we had this whole persona that we developed over the course. And Wexford was from Alabama, and he had a drinking problem. And he was always, and the articles were always these kind of long, elegiac. He would make the long drive up from Tuscaloosa to Toronto to coach an interview. It made no sense. But we developed, and people, I honestly believe, there's no way of checking this, of course, but I honestly believe people thought Wexford Harding existed. And he was always, I had thought about this for so many years, he was full of these kind of Southern epigrams. He was always, it's like he'd read just a little bit too much Faulkner, there was that kind of, that's where we were getting because we were reading Faulkner in our English class. So we were kind of importing that whole thing into Wexford Harding. And he was always, he had sort of moral problems with this or that, and he was just drinking rye in the it was just the whole thing was preposterous. But that's what I did. That's what.
What's funny is that you just created in me the sensation I sometimes feel when I'm reading your work, that you didn't answer my question. But I don't really care. So you can go on, or we can go back to what I actually asked you.
Oh, what was it you asked?
How you became a writer.
Oh.
You're telling me how you didn't. But
no, but I think that's how I did. I think
Wexford Harding is the answer?
Wexford Harding. By the way, how great is that name? It's just fantastic.
It's good.
It really is fantastic. I think that's how I became a writer. So I had the zine, I had Wexford Harding, and then I went to the American Spectator and I wrote these kind of, I forgot. I would just do these kind of things. And then I got to Washington when I got fired. I came to Washington, and I remember I thought my career was over. I remember actually I had put all my belongings in I remember this, a white Chevy Impala, and I drove from Indiana to Washington, D.C. because I knew someone in Washington, D.C., and I felt I could sleep under the floor for a while. And I thought, this is my big chance to make it in America, and I'd blown it. It was this to this day I remember sort of tearfully driving through West Virginia in the middle of the winter. And the song on the radio that was playing, because you go from one AM station to the other, and so you'd hear the same song over and again. The two songs were the song by Hall & Oates, METHOD, Method of Modern Love. But more importantly, that song, I Want to Know What Love Is by Foreigner. Is it Foreigner? Yeah, it's Foreigner. Yeah. And ever since then, I remember I devised in this teary trip a psychological questionnaire based on the song I Want to Know What Love Is. And all you do is you take every lyric and you turn it into a question. So question number 1 is, do you want to know what love is? If so, do you want me to show you? Do you need a little time? A, to think things over. In your life, is there heartache and pain? If so, have you come so? I've come so far. Can you take it all, or can you do it all again, or take it all again? I've forgotten. Anyway, it turns out that the lyrics of that song, every lyric works like a question on a psychological questionnaire, and it's not a bad questionnaire. It actually, starting out with the question, do you want to know what love is? Is there any? I mean, it goes straight to the heart of who you are, right? If so, do you want me to show you? I mean,
You're a walking digression.
I haven't thought about any of these things for such a long time.
It's good. It's very good. Let's go with it. You get with your questionnaire. You get to Washington. How do you break through and start?
I
think this is when I met you. Right after this.
No, later.
Was it later?
A little bit later.
You started at the Washington Post.
No, that was many years from that's 3 years away.
Oh, okay.
Because I'm still illegal, and then I get a job at this right-wing think tank, and I chose it because I went in, and they had an L-shaped office, and the entrance was at the top of the L, and they had the long spine of the L, and then it turned, and then there was the short end, and the office at the very, very foot of the bottom of the L. I realized the geography of the office was such that no one would ever go to that office. In other words, there was no reason for anyone to ever go in that office unless they were there explicitly to see you, right? So I went to apply for the job of like doing their newsletter or something, and I said, well, where did I work? And he said, well, in this office. And I realized, oh my God, I will have complete privacy. And this just like a light bulb goes on in my head. I was like, this is fantastic. I can essentially do whatever I want, and no one's ever going to know. They're not even going to know whether I'm in the office. Remember my history in high school, that leaving was... So I just thought, on that basis alone, I was like, oh, I'll take it. I mean, it's like, it was $12,000 a year, and I started to freelance because no one ever came into the office, because I had figured out correctly that was the... and then I was there for a while, and then I started did enough freelancing that I got on.
So what's the first thing you did? What's the first thing you did that caught people's attention?
I did pieces. Well, then my roommate was the person that we shared, Jacob Weisberg, who was an intern at the New Republic, and he got me into the New Republic. I published an article there because Jake made it happen. I was told, and Jacob was my roommate. I didn't even know him. He answered an ad in the paper. The whole thing is completely serendipitous. He wasn't going to take.
So the New Republic gave you your start.
Yeah,
they gave me my start too.
Yeah. In the same era. Yeah.
What was it about?
I don't remember. I don't remember. I think I was really good in those years at piggybacking with people who knew what they were doing. So I remember many of my early pieces were co-written with people who had written pieces for the New Republic.
That's kind of early stage Gladwell. You're kind of still doing the same thing, right? You finding people who...
Yes.
Yeah,
I never do. Why go alone? Why? What's
I'm
the
with
point?
you on this.
Yeah. No. I'm always looking for... It's more... I'm a little more sophisticated at it now than I was.
Mm-hmm.
Then I really was... I get an idea and I just call up someone and say, can I... what I would do, I remember that, actually now it's all coming back to me. Someone had written an article on a subject, and I had discovered some little tiny wrinkle. So I just got in touch with them and said, I have this little wrinkle that adds to this piece you've already written. Can we do it together? That was my...
So you wrote with other people?
Yeah, in the beginning, yeah.
When did you get a sense that you could actually make a living at this?
Well, I worked for a while, this is the nadir of my career, I worked for a while for a magazine that had been started by the Reverend Moon, and it was called Insight. And the Reverend Moon was throwing cash around DC like you've never seen. And the great the thing that sold me on, I went to the job interview, and the guy trying to hire me explained this as an outstanding amount of money that I was going to make. And he said, in justification of taking money from the Reverend Moon, money doesn't smell. And this is like, I was 22 and totally broke. And I was like, the thought that someone would say, as when they're trying to hire you onto some enterprise, money doesn't smell, that's why you should. I just thought that was hilarious. And then I got there and I realized they had no accounting controls. So you would take a trip and then you would just tell them how much you spent. So I just disappeared to England doing these stories, and I would take friends with me, and I would just say I spent, and I would just name some absurd number, and they would write you a check. It was ridiculous. Do you remember that song? I may sing a song here.
You can do that.
Do you remember the song Walking on the Moon by the Police?
How does it go?
Well, we did. We used to sing, because they paid us this enormous amount of money. Megabucks are what you make working for the moon. I hope my bank don't break working for the moon. And then the chorus was, some they say you're wasting your career away. No way, might as well stay. And then it goes on. I forgot the rest. But thank you. That was a lot of fun. And I went from there to the Washington Post.
And then you had a sense that this was a career.
Then I was finally legit. The joke was over at that point. I became a grown-up.
So we have about 3 minutes before we start taking questions from the audience.
Oh, we haven't discussed the book.
And I want to talk about the book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And one of the things that struck me about it, and I read a few of the reviews, and your reviews are the strangest things I read. That you hit nerves with people. Sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative, but I always feel they're not reviewing the book, they're reviewing you. And that they are either enamored with you or upset with you, but it's you. It's not the book.
Yeah.
And it happens over and over again. I feel like I put down the review and I feel like something smells about it, unlike Reverend Moon's money.
Yeah.
And we can go 10 minutes more. So this book, the first thing, when I picked it up, I thought the first story in it was sensational. The David and Goliath story. Briefly, because this book is new, probably nobody has read it yet, but we'll just quickly tell the story.
Oh, it's a retelling of the biblical story of David and Goliath.
Which is brilliant. Is it? I assumed it was original. Please tell me it is.
Well, turns out to be this huge amount of speculation about that story in various literatures, medical.
Of which I was totally unaware.
Yeah. It's really cool. There's two kind of interesting observations that are, one is that David's weapon, a sling, is an incredibly devastating weapon. It is not a child's toy. I talked to this hilarious ballistics expert for the Israeli Defense Force who had done the math on the stopping power of a stone fired at that speed. And it's equal, the stopping power of David's stone is equal to a .45 caliber handgun. So it's like that scene in Indiana Jones where, the guy has an Indy just takes out his thing. That's what David's doing. He has superior technology to Goliath. That's the first thing you have to understand. The second thing is that, the story has all this weirdness about Goliath. Goliath is led onto the valley floor by an attendant, which makes no sense. If he's a mighty warrior, why is someone leading him by the hand? He takes a long time to figure out what David is up to. In fact, he never really does. It's like he's completely oblivious to what's going on. And then the biblical story also has all these kind of knowing, winking comments about how slowly Goliath moves. And so people have thought about this and thought about Goliath's size and come to the conclusion that maybe he has acromegaly, which is, somebody knows, which is
maybe
a
someone has it.
Caused by a benign tumor on your pituitary gland. It causes an overproduction of human growth hormone. and causes giantism. So many of the giants in history have acromegaly. Andre the Giant, the wrestler. Abraham Lincoln, we think, maybe had acromegaly. And acromegaly has a side effect, which is it often compresses the optic nerves, leading to deficiencies in sight. So we think that Goliath is partially blind, which explains all of these anomalies, right? So here we have David armed with superior technology, stopping power.
A man with a handgun going up against a blind man now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why is he the underdog?
Right.
He's not the underdog. He's the favorite, right? In no way is he some improbable victory pulling off this massive upset. No, if he doesn't win, he's useless. I mean, Goliath is this pathetic guy who not only is suffering under a massive misapprehension about the nature of the battle, right? He brings a sword to a gunfight, and two, he's like, you know. So it's like when you realize that, you're like, huh. So we've been telling the story wrong for 3,000 years, right? So that's the beginning of the book.
So if that's the case, why is the story told the way it was told?
Well, because it's more romantically satisfying to tell it that way. Because we're invested. Well, that's one. But then the larger reason is because I think when it comes, and this is really what the book is about. When it comes to our mental accounting of advantages and disadvantages, I just think we're just nuts. We just are completely irrational. Like in the case of Goliath, why do we think Goliath is the favorite? Just because he's big, right? That's it.
Because he's big and because the assumed combat was going to be at close quarters. And
where he would have an advantage. But
Right.
that's a massive assumption.
Right.
But I just think, and many of the chapters in the book are just about interrogating our assumptions about advantage. You think this is an advantage. Why do you think a small class is an advantage for your child?
Can you remember when you first had the seeds of the idea that there was a book in this subject?
It was when I met, and by the way, this is very relevant. You should be here. I, as you know, I worship you, and my whole career.
Don't do this.
No.
Right.
No. I am not.
I'm James Lipton here.
No. Because this is dead serious. I'm actually being dead serious here. I have always wanted to write more like you. And I have been trying over my career to write books like you write books. That is to say, books that are about character and emotion. And this book is as close as I have ever gotten. And I don't think I'm there by any stretch of the imagination. But so I was very, 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 I had an encounter with a guy a couple years ago. And it was this guy named Vivek who lives in Silicon Valley. He's a Silicon Valley guy. And he was telling me about coaching his daughter's basketball team. And I thought, I can finally write a Michael Lewis story. And that story I wrote for The New Yorker on how this guy coached his daughter's 12-year-old team.
Why don't you explain it briefly?
So he's an Indian guy. And he wants to hang out with his daughter more. And she's 12, and she wants to play basketball. So he says, I'll coach it. But he has no idea what basketball is. He knows cricket. So he starts to go to basketball team games to kind of learn this strange thing. And he's like, I can't believe the way they play the game. It doesn't make any sense. Why does everyone run back into their own end and wait for the other team to bring the ball up? Why wouldn't you play defense the whole court all the time? Why don't you, in other words, play full court press all the time? Particularly if you're the weaker team, right? It makes no sense for the weaker team to allow the stronger team to more easily and quickly do the thing that sets the stronger team apart, which is pass and dribble and execute choreographed plays. It's like if you have a lousy team, you should try and delay the onset of the other team's offense as long as possible. You should full court press all the time. And he looks at his team and he realizes, my girls are really lousy. They have no basketball skills whatsoever. They are skinny girls from Menlo Park, right? You know what I'm talking about. They're all daughters of computer programmers. They are youth. So he looks at them and he's like, you know, we're just not going to win any games at all if we play normal. And so he takes these girls who can't play basketball and he says to them, we're not going to learn basketball. We're not going to dribble, pass, or shoot. You're just going to get in really good shape and you're going to do this. And so, you know, the one thing these girls have going, I mean, they realize he's right. They're not coming home and shooting baskets, right? They're coming home to dream about being marine biologists. And so they understand intuitively the genius behind this notion. And so they do this. And so they start to win games like 6-0. And
because when they get the ball, they get it right under their basket.
What they can do is shoot layups.
Yeah.
So Vivek does allow them to practice that particular skill because it will become necessary
to score a point.
To score the odd point.
Yes.
Right.
Also, just go on forever.
Yeah. Otherwise, so he does allow for the. But if the other team is not actually ever getting the ball across midcourt, as is the case, you don't have to score a lot to win, right? If the other team is at 0, really one basket will do the job. So they go all the way to the national championships. And so he told me this story. I didn't even know who he was. I met him at some conference, and because I was telling the story today, actually, because I was at Google. This is how he was before. I have a very mild form of, what's that prosopagnosia thing?
I'll trust you.
Where I can't remember people's faces. So I'm constantly, this has happened to me. Actually, I'll give you 2 great examples of this. One was, I was seated in a cafe in Miami, and I was working, and I was on deadline, and this woman sits down next to me, and she starts to try and engage me in conversation, and I'm like, leave me alone, I'm working, leave me alone. She tries. Finally, she gives up and starts chatting. And of course, the effect of my mild form of something is that it just takes me a long time to process people's face. So 10 minutes pass, and I think, she's really familiar. And then 10 more minutes pass, and I think, she's also really attractive. And then 10 more minutes pass, and I think, oh God, Jennifer Aniston. So that's one. Then I was at a conference, and I'm sitting next to some guy, and he's dressed sort of slightly schlubby way. And I figured, he's a grad student of some kind. So I was like, where'd you go to school? Where do you? He says, he grew up in Michigan, went to Michigan State. So I started chatting with him about Michigan State basketball. And we chat for a good 45 minutes about Michigan State basketball. And we talk a little bit about his graduate school stuff. And then, kind of looks vaguely familiar, but I can't place it. I get up, he gets up, I walk away, and someone comes up to me and said, "Do you know who you were talking to?" And I said, "No." He said, "Larry Page." We never got to the part where he was a billionaire. Anyway, so I meet this guy at his conference, and he turns out to be this big software mogul. But I just start talking about basketball, which is my default, apparently, when I don't know who someone is. And he told me the story, and I sat on it for years without realizing. And then it occurred to me when I was in one of my I want to be more like Michael Lewis phases, that this was, honestly, I was like, this is a Michael Lewis story. And I went to my editor and said, I think I can finally do a Michael Lewis story. And that was as close as I came.
The question actually was...
But that's where the book comes.
I just forgot, you've numbed my brain. That's where the book... But it's interesting because what you do better than anybody on the planet is you play with an idea. You take it all sorts of unexpected directions. And Michael Lewis would have taken that story, written a magazine piece. It would not have occurred to him that he had the wit to unspool it over 300 pages in the various forms that you have. I just wouldn't have made the connection.
But remember, necessity is the mother of invention. The reason I do that is that I don't feel I have the ability to take that story and make a whole book out of it. You could have taken that narrative. What you would have done is taken that and made a completely compelling book about, because the guy's story is actually incredibly fascinating. The story, and in the New Yorker piece I tried to do this, but the story of his software company is the same as the story of what he did with his daughter's basketball team. In other words, he was concerned with exactly the same problem in his work life as he was in his coaching. So it's actually a really beautiful, grand narrative, but I didn't think I had the chops to do it over a whole book. So what I did is I got ADD and just told a bunch of other stories to hide the fact that I couldn't pull off this particular.
But it forces you to think about the meaning of disadvantage in all kinds of different ways. Now I've got a lot of other things I could talk to you about, but we've got questions from the audience. Okay. Should we take them? The first one is, would you classify yourself as David? And if so, who is your Goliath?
No, I'm not David. What about the story I just told suggests that I was an underdog?
Yeah.
I mean, I've had the kind of blessedly trouble-free.
You never thought of yourself as an underdog?
Oh no, I thought I've jumped from one advantage to the next.
Yeah. How's this book been informed by your past books? Has it changed your theses?
Well, this is a kind of addendum to Outliers in the sense that Outliers was concerned with advantages as advantages. And this book says, no, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. There's a separate class of really interesting cases where the thing you thought was advantageous is not. So it is a kind of a continued exploration of the project of Outliers, which was to figure out if there are kind of rules about why people end up doing extraordinary things.
You know, the part of the book that was most striking to me, there were the two parts of the book that jumped off the page for me were the stories of the dyslexics. Your attempt to argue that dyslexia was an advantage.
In certain cases.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But one might also, if one were wanting to pick a fight with you, which I'm actually not here in this public forum, but maybe backstage, that if there are so many dyslexics on the planet, some of them end up successful. And you go find the successful ones, cherry pick them, and tell a story about them.
Yeah, you're being a killjoy right now.
Yeah, I am.
No, it's like, this is, people say this, and I'm like, the problem with that is, it's, in addition to being, maybe it's true, but there's a certain class of critical reaction that is out there, which is people who are determined at all costs not to enjoy themselves.
That's exactly right. You have found it. And you wonder why they're bothering themselves reading your books.
Yeah, like,
if they don't, just don't read it.
And I say this, and it comes across as people get even more upset when I say, look, if you don't like them, why do you keep reading them? It's a free country. If you're not into this particular project. Janet Maslin has now reviewed my books. She reviewed Blink, hated it. Outliers, hated it. This book, hated it. I'm like, Janet, come on. This is an exercise in masochism at this point. I feel sorry for her. She's sitting there like sweating her way through these books. I don't want her to suffer like this. Can we stop her before this? I want to go and give her a back rub so it's just not so painful.
The other story, which was incredibly moving, and all the stories, all of the arguments are encased in narrative. And the narratives take you places where you don't expect to go. And I think the great triumph in the book is the story of the two different responses parents have to losing children to violence. And it's going to take you a while to tell it because you're going to digress 18 different times. Could you briefly just give a quick summary of what that is? And then we'll go on with these questions.
Well, I struggled more with that chapter than any other chapter. It was really, really hard to figure out how to tell it. But it started with the story of 3 strikes in California is the story of a man who lost his daughter, right? Mike Reynolds in Fresno. His daughter is murdered by this drug-addled maniac. And he embarks on a crusade that results in 3 strikes. And 3 strikes is charitably a disaster for the state of California. But it is the result.
Though he continues to believe.
He continues to believe it is not. And he pursued that crusade in an entirely well-meaning way. He wanted to try and fix the law, criminal laws in his state, so that what happened to his daughter would not happen to anyone else's daughter. This was his attempt to make sense of his grief. I found in Canada a parallel story of a Mennonite woman whose daughter was murdered by some crazy predator. The stories are in the main, exactly the same, except that in Canada, the woman stood up the days after the day her daughter was murdered and said, even before they had caught her murderer, that she forgave her daughter's murderer. And she was not going to try and enlist the power of the state in any way to try and right the wrong. And they tell these two stories in parallel, and they're all about, there's two questions I'm interested in. One is that when you enlist the power of the state in the service of private crusades, there are all kinds of unintended consequences. That power, in other words, is an extraordinarily tricky and dangerous thing to use. It's not straightforward that's a big theme of the book, that we overestimate the value of enlisting the authority of big institutions. The second, more interesting question is, where on earth did this woman get the strength to forgive the murderer of her daughter? And that's a story about her faith. And the book, a lot of this book is about faith and the extraordinary power of the extraordinary power that belief, religious belief, gives people.
Tie it back into your main thesis. How is this a David and Goliath story?
Because the reason this woman found the strength to forgive her murderer is that Mennonites are historically a highly persecuted religious minority. So their history is not dissimilar to the history of the Jews. They're much smaller. But the Anabaptists, which the Mennonites are a part, Anabaptists were a dissident Protestant movement that arises out of Europe in the time of the Reformation. And they are persecuted at every stage. They're persecuted during the Inquisition, and then they move to Russia, where they are subjected to pogroms, just as Jews are. And the stories are as horrible as, and they eventually flee persecution in the 30s and move to Canada. So there are all these Mennonites in Canada who have family histories that are analogous to the histories of Jews who were persecuted in the Holocaust. Their families were wiped out. And the way they had interpreted this experience was they chose to turn the other cheek and to forgive their tormentors. And they felt that the only way they would survive as a people is if they walked away from the trauma and moved on with their lives. The big Mennonite mantra is you forgive and you move on. And the Mennonites, the stories that come out of the Mennonite community around forgiveness are so unbelievable. Another one that I never get over is one about an Amish mother whose son is hit by a car, and the car has been driven by a young kid. Some kid, probably been drinking. And the mother comes to the scene of the accident as her child is being mortally wounded, being taken off by an ambulance to his eventual death in the hospital. And the kid driving the car is in the back of the police car. And she goes over to the police car and she says to the policeman, "Will you take care of the boy?" And the policeman says, "Your boy will get every doctor will work as hard." She goes, No, I don't mean my child. I mean this boy, right? Her first instinct is she understands how deeply this kid is suffering. That's her first instinct, right? Like, that story is true, first of all, and incredible. But that's the tradition this woman came out of. Those are the stories they told, right? And so what they derived from the most horrible kind of adversity, essentially their community suffering through pogrom after pogrom, what they derived from that was insane strength in the face of tragedy. And she draws on that. That's the experience she learned. And the book ends with two stories like that in a row, because that's where I want you to end up, with a kind of an appreciation for the beautiful things that can emerge from darkness.
So there's an audience question that follows very naturally from what you just said. Where do you place the role of God or divine providence or luck in the outcomes of your case studies?
Well, very centrally. It's funny. I come from a very, very religious family.
You
and
do?
Community. I do, yeah. And I had drifted away from that. And I have to say, in all honesty, writing this book has brought me back to that. Just because you can't talk to people. You can't talk to someone who has forgiven the murderer of their daughter and not come away with an appreciation for the power of religious faith. You can't. I mean, unless you're completely insensible to human emotion.
How's it, when you're sitting down with him, how does it feel differently than being with the father of who hasn't forgiven the murderer?
He was this guy Mike Reynolds, for whom I have an infinite amount of compassion. But it's been 20 years, and he is still utterly consumed by his daughter's death. He has no peace whatsoever. And it was heartbreaking. And I say in the book, when I meet him, at one point he wants to after the interview's over, he wants to take me to the place where his daughter was killed. And I can't go. It's just too much. It's just like, and then, to contrast that with just a few months later, I go up to Winnipeg and I talk to this woman, Wilma Dirksen. And the kind of, you understand that she has managed to carve out some peace. And, she has restored her family and her belief in God and her faith in her community, even in the face of this tragedy. And to understand that, to contrast those two is just, it was really overwhelming. I mean, it was just kind of, I was so, I don't think I've ever been so emotionally moved by the act of reporting a story.
You said recently that you never wanted anybody who sat down with you to regret having sat down with you.
Yeah.
How do you think Mike Reynolds feels?
I spent more time on the Mike Reynolds part of the book than any other part of the book, precisely because of that fear. I disagree profoundly with the course he took. I think that we will look back on the Three Strikes era in California as one of the darkest episodes in the history of the state. I honestly believe that. But I also believe that he pursued it for the right reasons. I don't think there is a malicious or bone in his body. I mean, I think he was a man who was genuinely trying to find some way to resolve the pain of his daughter's death and thought he was doing the right thing.
He thought he was going to prevent other people from having to go through this.
He thought that by so dramatically increasing the severity of criminal laws in this state, he would save lives. I think he believed that truly, and still does believe that truly. And so the difficulty, the challenge in writing that chapter was to find a way to disagree with him honestly, without denying the sincerity with which he acted. And did I pull it off? I don't know. I mean, that's for anyone who reads the book to judge.
Well, I wonder, has he read it?
I haven't heard from him.
You haven't heard from him?
I mean, the book just came out, so I don't know. I know he will disagree. I don't know whether he will think I dealt with him sincerely. Like I say, that is the thing about the book that keeps me awake about, is that did I deal with him fairly?
Would you comment on your racial, ethnic background, its role in your early life identity, any role it plays in your work, and whether you may ever write about race in the U.S. or globally?
Well, I've written a lot about race, and in my last book I wrote very specifically about my mother's history and the particular, and I've written for The New Yorker about race a couple times. I feel like I've said And in Blink, I had a big thing about race. I feel I have nothing left to say about race, which is not to say that there is not, I think there is an infinite amount to be said about race in this country. But in terms of my own personal story, I have exhausted the topic.
How often are you asked to comment on it?
Sometimes. I mean, there's a very peculiar thing because I did not grow up, in Canada did not grow up conscious of my racial heritage. So Canadians are so sort of, particularly in the part of Canada we grew up, everyone was so chill about these things that I kind of forgot that my mom was black for about 20 years. And then I moved to America and I was like, oh, like it's a big deal down here. And then, can I digress and tell a story?
Of course you can.
It was such a non-issue growing up that it was only 2 years ago that my father told me the following story. My father marries my mother in England in 1958, right? White guy marries a black woman, fairly radical act. They moved to Jamaica, and where he's teaching at the University of West Indies. And he needs to get access. I love this story so much. He needs to get access. By the way, this is everything you need to know about my father is contained in this story. It's just about my dad. Right? It is why I love this man with all my heart. He needs to get access to a book because it's pre-internet age. He's a mathematician. He needs some complicated textbook. He canvasses around. He finds out the closest copy is in the library at Georgia Tech. So he writes to them and says, "Can I come and use your library?" And they write back and say yes. Little does he know that this request touches off this wave of panic inside the bureaucracy at Georgia Tech because they're like, it's 1960. Georgia Tech is a segregated institution, and they have just said yes to a professor from the University of West Indies to come and use their research facilities. And they're like, oh, shit. So they start this frantic search to discover whether Professor Graham Gladwell is white or black. And they can't figure it out. They try, first of all, they thought, okay, we're going to do a misdirection. My dad finds this all out subsequently. They do a misdirection, and they start frantically calling his thesis advisor in England to find out, what color is this dude? And they can't get a hold of him. It's 1960, they don't have phones in people's offices in, University College London. So then, okay, we got no choice. We got to call University of West Indies. University of West Indies, making a call from America to Jamaica in 1960 is not an easy matter. My parents don't have a phone at home. They're frantic, right? Finally, the day my father's about to leave, and by the way, the journey is like boat to Miami, bus fare, bus from Miami to Atlanta. My dad only has enough money to get to Atlanta. The day before he's leaving, finally they track him down. And my dad gets the call, which is as follows. Professor Gladwell, yes. This is Professor so-and-so, yes. I have a question to ask before you leave on this epic journey. Yes. Are you white? Yes. Oh, thank God. So my father suddenly realizes what's going on. So he gets to Georgia, and this is the great part. He gets to Atlanta, and of course because he's a visiting professor, they take him out to dinner, all these dignitaries in the department, and halfway through dinner, my father starts to sort of open up. He says, I just got married. I would love to show you all a picture of my wife. Reaches into his pocket, pulls out an 8x10. Anyway,
that's a very upmarket version of the Blazing Saddles scene.
Yes.
Where are the white women at? Yeah. All right. So someone wants us to shift to sports briefly.
All right.
Do you believe that Lance Armstrong and other athletes accused of using PEDs should not be held responsible? I thought I said should not be in hell. Should not be held responsible or punished?
Well, this is in reference to a piece I did for the New Yorker where I puzzled about the whole PED issue because although I am formally opposed to their use, as someone who is formally opposed to their use, I believe I have an obligation to come up with a good argument about whether they should be legal. And I think all the arguments we use against PEDs at the moment are really terrible. And the one I always come back to is, and this I made this point in the piece, in the sport of baseball, it is perfectly legal. In fact, more than legal. It is considered to be a wonderful thing to remove the ulnar collateral ligament from your elbow, the ligament that is principally implicated in pitching. Right? Remove it and replace it with a tendon taken from either a cadaver or from some other part of your body, a tendon which is in every way has superior performance characteristics to the ligament that was put there by God. Put it in, and in so doing, not only just extend your career, but possibly make it possible for you to pitch more effectively, right? That, totally fine, right? No one's got a problem with it. In fact, the guy who pioneers this procedure is such a hero, he will probably end up in the Baseball Hall of Fame, right? Okay, that's fine,
all true.
right? But for a baseball player like A-Rod to inject himself with a copy of a naturally occurring hormone available by prescription to everyone in this room, right? That's so wrong. A-Rod, for you to do that, A-Rod, we're gonna drum you out of baseball. Why is it okay for the pitcher to do something performance enhancing, but not for the hitter? And then Lance, what did Lance want to do? Lance wanted to inject himself with his own blood. So it's wrong to inject yourself with your own blood, but totally fine to take a completely foreign object from a cadaver and stick it in your elbow. Until we can resolve that contradiction, I can't in good conscience jump up and down and get excited about PED use, right? Isn't this a problem?
So why, if you can't think of a good argument not to use them, why do they bother you at all?
Why? Because, well, I'm a big fan of track, and I don't want it does ruin the sport. But you have to have rules. I mean, this is a big part, the big theme of this in my book, that for authority to work, it must be legitimate. And the rules we have now about PED use are illegitimate. That's why they're being violated so regularly. A-Rod's no dummy. He looks at this and says, 75% of the pitchers in the major leagues have bionic elbows. I'm not allowed to inject myself with testosterone. That's what he's saying, and you know what? He's right. So, I mean, it matters because if you're going to effectively police sports, you got to have good arguments. Otherwise, it's never going to work.
So
right?
why does it bother you?
Why does it bother me?
Why don't I just come out pro-ped?
Well, I don't know.
Just come out for them.
What's that?
Why not just be for them? If you can't think of a good reason, why not?
I want to think of a good. I don't want to be. Well, so track is the sport I love most. It's really, really clear that lots and lots of runners were using EPO in the 90s because the times are just crazy in the 90s in distance running. And it sort of trashes the sport because records are meaningless. There's all these insane records that just, and no one can ever. So, I mean, it disrupts, it ruins.
It creates discontinuities when people discover new forms of enhancement.
Yeah, so I don't want that, but I do, but I don't think we'll ever be able to stop it unless we can come up with better arguments. I don't know. I know that my position is lame here.
Okay. That's all I wanted to get to. All right. All right. So what surprised you most in your research over the years?
Oh, wow, what an open-ended
It is
question.
open. You can do it. We can go a long way with this.
Yeah,
we only have a few minutes left, but why don't you go ahead and try to do that?
What surprises me most? Well, I'm always surprised by what surprises me, what you don't realize until you there are a couple things you realize when you become a journalist that you would never otherwise know about the world. The first thing you realize is when you're a journalist is that much of what all of us believe is not true. I don't mean in a gross macro way, I mean in a very, very micro way. That when someone tells you a story about something that happened to them or that they observed, many of the details are likely to be erroneous, right? Some erroneous in a small way, some. So that's really, really surprising. It takes years as a journalist to accept that fact. And the mistake that rookie journalists always make is they forget this, and they get told something, and they write it down. And of course, it's filled with errors, right? Because people, honestly, they're not lying to you. Just much of what's in our heads is not accurate. But the other interesting thing is that almost everyone has a really, really great story to tell and are not aware of the fact that they have a great story to tell. That's the thing that I think you know this almost as well as anyone, that insane numbers of people have some fascinating thing in their life. And because it's their life, they have no perspective on it, so they don't even realize it's fascinating. And all you have to do is keep the tape recorder running long enough, and you will find it. So I had this, I'm only laughing because, and I've been telling this story all week, so it's getting old, but I ran into this guy from Procter & Gamble. And Procter is, of course, the nerdiest of all companies, right? It's everything at Procter has to be supported with research. They will not, if they say that this is the new and improved Tide, they're not lying. It's new and improved Tide, right? And if you ask, they will ship you cartons of PhD theses that will testify to why that, right? So there is nothing done by chance at Procter & Gamble. It's a company founded by Germans, right? So I've talked to this guy from Procter & Gamble, and he starts saying about the thing that drives him crazy more than anything else is Arm & Hammer baking soda toothpaste. Why? Because it doesn't work, right? He's like, one of their competitors makes a product that has like 7% market share, which all kinds of people think works because it says baking soda, but they've done the tests and they've done the math. It does not work. And he will not rest as a toothpaste guy until he has driven that product from the marketplace. And as he was talking, I just had this sense of like, this is so fantastic. How can I make this into a story? Like, how can you not want to read a story that has that moment when the guy from Procter, you're in the office in Cincinnati, and he's like, the filing cabinets are next to him, right? And he says, he brings up the subject of Arm & Hammer, and you say, of course, as you would, really? Right? Just kind of egg him on, right? How can that be true, right? And then he reaches over and pulls open the drawer, and there it all is. Report after report on the scam that is Arm & Hammer baking soda toothpaste.
But he himself is not aware that this is interesting.
I don't think he realizes how genius that is.
Yeah.
And I don't mean it. By the way, I will say parenthetically, there's only one way this story works, and that is that by the end of it, you share his outrage. In other words, it doesn't work if you treat him as a figure of fun. He's not a figure of fun. He's actually why the world goes round. Like, it's people like that are the reason things work, right? So you can't meet him and make fun of him. No. You have to convince everyone that, oh, he's absolutely right. And unless those scumbags over there at Arm & Hammer, So that's the, and I've been, ever since then, I've been literally on between stops on this thing. I've just been thinking about, okay, so what is that? What's the story what's the larger story here? Because there is a larger story here. And I figured out most of it.
All right, so this takes us to this naturally. I've heard you say you don't consider yourself to be a journalist. Can you comment?
No, I do think of myself as a journalist. I don't, all the other words that are used to describe me, I don't think are true. No, I think of myself, and I think that's the highest. People are always confusing me with the people that I write about.
Yeah.
I don't have these. It's sometimes annoying because the criticism, I don't have these grand thoughts. Other people do. I'm telling you about what they think. I'm adding my own context.
Yeah.
But, I'm not a great thinker. I'm a journalist. I turn the tape recorder on. That's what my contribution is. It's not a minor contribution, by the way. It's like but yeah, I do think of myself as a journalist.
Ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm Gladwell. And I need to tell them something. On your way out, if you haven't collected your book, there are books for people who haven't collected their books on the way out. The books are waiting for you. Thank you very much.